Hi, my name is Maya Rodriguez, and 3 days ago, my mother-in-law told our entire family that I was nothing but a charity case who trapped her son into marriage. She said it with a smile at her own anniversary dinner while I sat there in the dress I'd saved for months to buy. But this isn't a story about money or status. This is about what happens when someone mistakes quiet strength for weakness and discovers that some people's past isn't written in designer labels. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The invitation came on cream-colored cardstock, embossed with gold lettering that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Margaret and Charles Whitmore cordially invite you to celebrate their 30th wedding anniversary. Black tie required. I stared at those last three words until they blurred. Black tie required meant a dress I couldn't afford, shoes that would max out my credit card, and sitting at a table where everyone would know exactly how much I didn't belong. I met David in the most ordinary way possible. Coffee shop, rainy Tuesday, we both reached for the last blueberry muffin. He insisted I take it, bought me a latte to go with it, and somehow that 20-minute conversation turned into 3 years of the most genuine love I'd ever known. He never asked about my background, never seemed to notice that I shopped at thrift stores or that my car made suspicious noises when it rained. David saw me, not my bank account. His family was different. The Whitmores owned half the commercial real estate in downtown Seattle. Their house in Bellevue had a circular driveway, a 3-car garage, and windows that overlooked Lake Washington like a postcard. The first time David brought me home, Margaret Whitmore looked me up and down with the precision of a jeweler appraising a questionable stone. She smiled, but her eyes stayed cold. "Where did you say you went to school, dear?" she asked during that first dinner. The question hung in the air like smoke. I told her about community college, about working my way through a business degree, one class at a time. She nodded politely, but I caught the glance she shared with her husband, the kind of look that said everything they needed to know about David's poor judgment. For 3 years, I endured those looks, the subtle comments about David's future, about the kind of woman who would complement his career trajectory. Margaret never said anything directly cruel. She was too refined for that. Instead, she would mention other women, successful women, women with pedigrees and trust funds and the right kind of education, women who would fit seamlessly into their world. David proposed on a hiking trail overlooking Mount Rainier. No elaborate setup, no photographer hiding in the bushes, just him and me and a ring he'd saved for 6 months to buy. When we told his parents, Margaret's smile looked like it might crack her face. "How wonderful," she said, though her voice suggested otherwise. "We should start planning right away. Small ceremony, I assume." The wedding planning became a battlefield disguised as family bonding. Margaret had opinions about everything. The venue was too modest, the catering company wasn't prestigious enough, my dress, which I loved, apparently sent the wrong message about our family standards. I tried to stay quiet, to pick my battles, but every conversation felt like a test I was designed to fail. David defended me when he heard the comments, but Margaret was careful. She saved her sharpest observations for when he wasn't around. During the dress fitting, she mentioned how important it was for David to marry someone who could support his ambitions. At the venue walkthrough, she wondered aloud if I understood the social obligations that came with being part of their family. Each comment was wrapped in concern, delivered with the smile of someone who believed she was helping. The worst part wasn't the cruelty, it was the way she made me doubt myself. Late at night, I would lie awake wondering if she was right. Maybe David deserved someone better, someone who could navigate charity galas and business dinners without feeling like an imposter. Maybe love wasn't enough when the gap between worlds was this wide. But David never wavered. He loved me fiercely, protectively, completely. When I told him about his mother's comments, his jaw would tighten, his hands would clench, but he never stopped believing we belonged together. "You're not the problem," he would say, pulling me close. "She is, and one day she'll see what I see." The wedding was beautiful, despite Margaret's interference. Small, intimate, perfect for us. During the reception, she gave a speech about welcoming me into the family, about how happy she was that David had found someone who made him smile. The words were right, but her tone suggested she was reading from a script she didn't believe. Our first year of marriage was peaceful, mostly because we lived across town, far enough away that family dinners were optional rather than obligatory. I found work at a nonprofit downtown, managing their fundraising operations. The pay wasn't impressive, but the work mattered. David was proud of me, even if his family couldn't understand why I would choose purpose over profit. The anniversary invitation forced us back into their orbit. 30 years of marriage was apparently too significant to miss, even for the daughter-in-law who didn't quite measure up. David insisted we go. "It's important to Mom," he said, "and maybe this will be a chance for you two to connect better." I wanted to tell him that his mother had no interest in connecting with me, but I loved him too much to poison that well. Shopping for the dress took 3 weeks and depleted my savings account. Black tie meant formal, meant expensive, meant a level of elegance I'd never needed before. The sales associate at Nordstrom was kind but honest about my budget limitations. We found something that worked, a navy blue gown that made me feel sophisticated even if the price tag made me sick. The night of the anniversary party, I stood in front of our bedroom mirror adjusting the dress for the 100th time. David came up behind me, his hands on my shoulders, his reflection meeting mine in the glass. "You look incredible," he said. I wish I felt as confident as his words suggested. The Whitmore house was transformed for the occasion. White lights wrapped around every tree in the yard.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Valet parking filled the circular driveway. A string quartet played near the French doors that opened onto the back patio. Inside, the house buzzed with conversation and laughter, the sound of people comfortable in their own success. Margaret looked radiant in a silver gown that probably cost more than my car. She moved through the crowd like a queen holding court, accepting congratulations and compliments with practiced grace. When she saw us arrive, her smile brightened with what looked like genuine warmth. "David, darling, you look so handsome. And Maya, what a lovely dress." I thanked her, feeling awkward and overdressed and underdressed all at once. She guided us toward the bar, introduced us to friends and business associates, played the role of gracious hostess perfectly. For a moment, I let myself hope that maybe tonight would be different. Maybe she was ready to accept me, to see me as more than an obstacle to her son's bright future. The illusion lasted until dinner. The dining room had been arranged with 3 large tables, each seating 8 people. David and I were placed at the table farthest from the head table, surrounded by distant relatives and family friends I'd never met. Margaret's table sparkled with the inner circle, the people who mattered most in her carefully curated world. Conversation at our table was polite but stilted. The woman next to me asked about my work, seemed genuinely interested in the nonprofit sector until she learned about my salary range. The man across from me mentioned real estate investments and seemed surprised when I couldn't contribute to the discussion. I smiled and nodded and felt smaller with each passing minute. After the main course, Margaret stood to give a speech. The room quieted as she thanked everyone for celebrating with them, for being part of their journey, for supporting their family through 3 decades of marriage. She spoke about love and commitment and the importance of choosing the right partner. Her eyes found mine across the room as she talked about the qualities that mattered most in a spouse. Stability, she said, shared values, the ability to enhance rather than diminish one's potential. Then she shifted to talking about their children. David was their pride and joy, she said, a successful attorney with unlimited potential. She talked about his achievements, his bright future, the woman he would eventually marry. Eventually. As if I weren't sitting 20 feet away wearing his ring. The slight was so subtle that most people probably missed it, but I felt it like a slap. David's hand found mine under the table, squeezing tight, his jaw clenched with controlled anger. I squeezed back, telling him silently that I was okay, that we would get through this together. But Margaret wasn't finished. As the evening wound down, as guests began to move toward the living room for coffee and dessert, she approached our table with the grace of a predator who had cornered her prey. She thanked everyone for coming, made small talk about the weather and the wine, and then turned to me with that familiar smile. Maya, dear, she said, her voice carrying just far enough for the whole table to hear. I've been meaning to ask about your family. Will they be joining us for any upcoming holidays? The question seemed innocent enough, but I knew where it was heading. My family lived 3 states away, worked blue-collar jobs, celebrated holidays in modest homes with potluck dinners and folding chairs. I told her they might visit for Christmas, trying to keep my voice steady. She nodded thoughtfully, as if processing important information. That's nice, she said. It must be difficult for David, having to balance such different worlds. I'm sure it's quite an adjustment for him, learning to navigate relationships with people from such, she paused delicately, such different circumstances. The words hung in the air like poison. Different circumstances. Code for poor. Code for beneath us. Code for not good enough for our son. The woman next to me suddenly found her dessert fascinating. The man across from me checked his phone with urgent concentration. Everyone at the table heard exactly what she meant. David started to respond, his voice tight with anger, but Margaret continued before he could speak. Of course, love conquers all, doesn't it? She smiled at me with the warmth of a glacier. Though I do worry sometimes about the long-term challenges. Financial compatibility, social expectations, the ability to support one's spouse in their professional and personal growth. My face burned with humiliation and rage. She was discussing my worthiness as a wife like I was a business investment with questionable returns, in front of strangers, in front of her son, with the casual cruelty of someone who believed she was entitled to pass judgment on my entire existence. I could have fought back, could have defended myself, challenged her assumptions, pointed out that love and character mattered more than bank balances and zip codes. But something in her expression told me that she wanted me to fight, wanted me to lose my composure, to prove that I was exactly as unsuitable as she believed. Instead, I smiled. Thank you for your concern, Margaret. I appreciate how much you care about David's happiness. Then I excused myself to use the restroom, walking away with as much dignity as I could manage while my world crumbled around the edges. In the bathroom, I stared at my reflection and tried to breathe. The dress that had made me feel elegant now felt like a costume, like I was playing a role I was never meant for. Margaret's words echoed in my head, each one a fresh wound. Financial compatibility, social expectations, different circumstances. As if my worth as a human being could be measured by my credit score and my parents' professions. When I emerged, David was waiting in the hallway, his face dark with fury. "We're leaving," he said, "now." I started to protest, to suggest we stay for appearances, but he shook his head. "I won't let her treat you like that. Not in my presence. Not ever." We said our goodbyes quickly, politely, with the brittle courtesy of people pretending everything was fine. Margaret hugged us both, thanked us for coming, told us how lovely it was to celebrate with family. Her performance was flawless, as if the conversation at dinner had never happened. The drive home was silent, except for the sound of David's hands gripping the steering wheel hard enough to make the leather creak. I stared out the window at the dark water of Lake Washington, at the expensive houses with their perfect lawns and their perfect lives, and wondered how long we could keep pretending that love was enough to bridge the gap between his world and mine. At home, David exploded with the fury he'd been holding back all evening. "She's poison," he said, pacing our small living room like a caged animal. "Absolute poison. How dare she speak to you like that? How dare she question our marriage in front of strangers?" I tried to calm him, to suggest that maybe she was just protective of him, but he wasn't hearing it. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "She's been doing this since we started dating. The subtle digs, the comparisons, the way she talks about you like you're temporary, like you're some phase I'll grow out of when I come to my senses." He sat down hard on our couch, head in his hands. I should have stopped her years ago. I sat beside him, took his hands in mine, tried to find words that might ease his pain without dismissing my own. "Your mother loves you," I said carefully. "She wants what she thinks is best for you. Maybe in her mind, that doesn't include me, but that's her limitation, not ours. He looked at me with eyes full of grief and love and helpless anger. How can you be so calm about this? He asked. How can you sit here and defend her after what she just did to you? I wasn't defending her, exactly. I was trying to survive this with my dignity intact, trying to protect the man I loved from having to choose between his family and his wife. But the truth was, I wasn't calm. I was devastated. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every word of Margaret's assault. Financial compatibility, the ability to support one's spouse, different circumstances. Each phrase was designed to highlight my inadequacy, to remind everyone present that I was an outsider who had somehow infiltrated their pristine world. But as the hours passed and my anger cooled into something sharper and more focused, I began to think about the assumptions Margaret had made, about my background, my family, my capacity to support David in his ambitions. She saw someone poor and powerless, someone grateful to be accepted into her rarefied circle. She saw someone who would quietly endure humiliation rather than risk losing her place at the table. What she didn't see was the truth. What she couldn't possibly know was that poverty and powerlessness weren't the same thing. That some people's strength was forged in fires she couldn't imagine, tempered by experiences that didn't appear on resumes or tax returns. That the quiet woman she'd just publicly dismissed had a past that would have terrified her if she'd bothered to learn about it. The next morning, David left early for a business trip to Portland. He kissed me goodbye with the fierce protectiveness of someone trying to shield me from his family's toxicity. I'll talk to her when I get back, he promised. This ends now. I nodded and smiled and waved him off, but I knew he couldn't fix this with conversation. Margaret's contempt for me ran too deep, was too fundamental to who she was. After he left, I sat at our kitchen table with a cup of coffee and thought about secrets. About the parts of our past we choose to share and the parts we keep locked away. About the assumptions people make when they only see the surface of someone's life. David knew I'd served in the military before college, but he didn't know the details, didn't know about the training, the missions, the things I'd seen in places most people couldn't find on a map. I'd never told him about the team, about the bonds forged in conditions that made civilian friendships seem like pleasant conversation. About the people who would drop everything and travel across the world if I called and said I needed them. About the skills that didn't translate to polite dinner conversation but had kept me alive when death was a constant companion. Margaret thought she knew me, thought I was just some poor girl who'd gotten lucky with her son. She had no idea who she was actually dealing with, no concept of the network of loyalty and protection that surrounded me like invisible armor. She'd declared war on someone she assumed was defenseless, someone who would absorb her attacks in grateful silence. She was about to learn how wrong she was. That afternoon, I made a phone call I hadn't made in 3 years. The number was burned into my memory, had been my lifeline during the darkest days of my service. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Ghost," the voice said, using my old call sign. "Thought you disappeared into civilian life forever." Commander Sarah Chen had been my team leader, my mentor, my closest friend during our deployment in Afghanistan. After we'd both left the service, she'd transitioned into private security, building a company that specialized in protection services for high-profile clients. We'd stayed in touch sporadically, but the distance between our old lives and our new ones had grown wider each year. "I need a favor," I said, and she laughed, a sound that brought back memories of shared danger and absolute trust. "When do you not need a favor?" she replied. "What's going on?" I told her about the anniversary dinner, about Margaret's public humiliation, about the pattern of subtle cruelty that had defined our relationship. I told her about David's business trip and the confrontation that was coming when he returned. Sarah listened without interrupting, the way she used to listen to mission briefings. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "So the mother-in-law thinks you're some helpless charity case," she said finally, "thinks she can publicly humiliate you without consequences." I confirmed that was essentially correct. "What do you want me to do about it?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "I want her to understand that some people's backgrounds aren't what they appear to be," I said.
I want her to realize that dismissing someone as powerless might not be the smartest strategy.
And I want David to see that his wife is capable of handling herself, with or without his protection. Sarah's laughter this time was darker, more predatory. You want to show them who you really are, she said. I can work with that. Give me details about the next family gathering, the location, the guest list. Let me see what kind of statement we can make. I told her about the family brunch planned for the following Sunday, about Margaret's tradition of hosting elaborate gatherings to showcase her social status. Leave it to me, Sarah said. And Ghost, she added, using my call sign one more time, it'll be good to work together again. After she hung up, I sat in the silence of our apartment and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The calm that came before action, the steady focus that had carried me through missions where failure meant death. Margaret thought she'd won, thought she'd successfully put me in my place, reminded me of my proper position in her family's hierarchy. She had no idea that her little speech had just triggered a response she was completely unprepared for. The poor, powerless woman she'd humiliated was about to introduce her to the highly trained, deeply connected, absolutely formidable person she actually was. Sunday brunch was going to be very interesting. The call came at 6 in the morning, 3 days before the family brunch. I was already awake, sitting on our balcony with coffee and watching the sunrise paint Seattle's skyline in shades of gold and pink. David's phone buzzed first, then mine, then his again. Emergency at the firm, he said, grabbing clothes from the closet. Major client crisis. I'll probably be there all weekend. I kissed him goodbye and watched him drive away, knowing that Margaret had probably orchestrated this crisis to keep him busy. She was intelligent, calculating, always 3 moves ahead in whatever game she was playing. But intelligence without complete information was just elaborate guesswork, and she was about to discover how much she didn't know about the woman she'd chosen as her enemy. Sarah arrived that afternoon in a black SUV with tinted windows that screamed federal government. She stepped out wearing jeans and a casual sweater, but her posture, the way she scanned the street before approaching my door, marked her as military to anyone trained to recognize the signs. 3 years of civilian life hadn't softened the edges that made her one of the most effective operators I'd ever worked with. She hugged me like a sister, which is what she'd become during our deployment. Squad leaders and team members, we'd shared foxholes and firefights, trusted each other with our lives on a daily basis. The bond forged in those conditions didn't fade just because we'd traded combat zones for conference rooms. Tell me about the layout, she said, once we were inside. We spread building schematics across my dining room table. Margaret's house in Bellevue, the grounds, the usual security measures for a family of their social standing. Which is to say, almost none. A basic alarm system, maybe cameras at the front entrance, the kind of protection that deterred opportunistic crime but wouldn't slow down professionals for more than 30 seconds. Sarah studied the blueprints with the focused intensity she'd once brought to mission planning. Standard suburban fortress, she said. All flash, no substance. Rich people think money equals security, but they never consider that real threats don't announce themselves. She traced the property lines with her finger, noting sight lines, access points, vulnerabilities that Margaret would never think to protect. "What's the guest list for this brunch?" Sarah asked. I showed her the text Margaret had sent, copied to the entire extended family. 35 people, including David's aunts and uncles, his cousins, several family friends who'd known him since childhood. The kind of gathering where Margaret could hold court, where everyone could admire her perfect house and her perfect life, and her son's unfortunate choice in wives. Sarah made notes in the precise handwriting I remembered from after-action reports. Civilian targets, she said, using the clinical terminology that made everything feel manageable. High-value personalities who think they understand power because they've never encountered the real thing. She looked up at me, her expression serious. "Are you sure you want to do this, Ghost? Once we cross this line, there's no going back to playing nice."
I thought about Margaret's smile as she'd humiliated me in front of strangers, about the years of subtle cruelty, the constant reminders that I wasn't good enough for her son, about David's broken expression when he'd tried to defend me and realized how futile the gesture was. I'm sure, I said. She needs to understand that some people's backgrounds aren't what they appear to be. Sarah nodded and pulled out her phone. Within an hour, she'd assembled a team. Not active duty, of course. These were private contractors, former special operations personnel who now worked in executive protection and security consulting. People who understood the value of making a statement without crossing legal lines. People who owed Sarah favors or respected her enough to take on an unusual assignment. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. No threats, no violence, nothing that could be construed as illegal or dangerous. Just a demonstration of capability, a reminder that the woman Margaret had dismissed as powerless had resources she'd never imagined. The kind of resources that could materialize anywhere, anytime, for any reason. Friday morning, Sarah's advance team conducted surveillance on the Whitmore property. By Friday evening, they'd mapped every security camera, identified the blind spots, noted the patrol patterns of the private security company that drove through the neighborhood twice per shift. Margaret's fortress was about as secure as a suburban shopping mall, which is to say, not at all. Saturday, the team ran rehearsals in a warehouse south of the city. They practiced movements, timing, communication protocols, not because the mission was particularly complex, but because precision mattered. The goal wasn't to intimidate or frighten anyone. It was to demonstrate professional competence at a level that would reframe every assumption Margaret had made about my background and capabilities. David called Saturday night from the office, exhausted and frustrated by whatever crisis was keeping him there. "I'm sorry about tomorrow," he said. "I know how much you were dreading it, and now you'll have to face them alone." I told him not to worry, that I could handle his family without him. The confidence in my voice seemed to surprise him. "Are you okay?" he asked. "You sound different, calmer." I told him I felt different, that something had shifted since the anniversary dinner, that I was tired of letting other people define my worth, tired of absorbing cruelty in silence. "I'm sure," I said. "She needs to understand that some people's backgrounds aren't what they appear to be." Sarah nodded and pulled out her phone. Within an hour, she'd assembled a team. Not active duty, of course. These were private contractors, former special operations personnel who now worked in executive protection and security consulting. People who understood the value of making a statement without crossing legal lines. People who owed Sarah favors or respected her enough to take on an unusual assignment. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. No threats, no violence, nothing that could be construed as illegal or dangerous. Just a demonstration of capability, a reminder that the woman Margaret had dismissed as powerless had resources she'd never imagined. The kind of resources that could materialize anywhere, anytime, for any reason. Friday morning, Sarah's advance team conducted surveillance on the Whitmore property. By Friday evening, they'd mapped every security camera, identified the blind spots, noted the patrol patterns of the private security company that drove through the neighborhood twice per shift. Margaret's fortress was about as secure as a suburban shopping mall, which is to say, not at all. Saturday, the team ran rehearsals in a warehouse south of the city. They practiced movements, timing, communication protocols, not because the mission was particularly complex, but because precision mattered. The goal wasn't to intimidate or frighten anyone. It was to demonstrate professional competence at a level that would reframe every assumption Margaret had made about my background and capabilities. David called Saturday night from the office, exhausted and frustrated by whatever crisis was keeping him there. "I'm sorry about tomorrow," he said. "I know how much you were dreading it, and now you'll have to face them alone." I told him not to worry, that I could handle his family without him. The confidence in my voice seemed to surprise him. "Are you okay?" he asked. "You sound different, calmer." I told him I felt different, that something had shifted since the anniversary dinner, that I was tired of letting other people define my worth, tired of absorbing cruelty in silence.
He was quiet for a moment, then said he loved me, that he was proud of me, that everything would be better when this client crisis ended. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright,
the kind of Seattle day that made the mountains look close enough to touch. I dressed carefully in a simple black dress, understated jewelry, comfortable shoes. Nothing that screamed military, nothing that would seem out of place at a family brunch. The only unusual element was the small earpiece hidden beneath my hair, connecting me to Sarah's command frequency. Margaret's house looked exactly as I remembered it. Manicured lawn, circular driveway already filled with expensive cars, the kind of casual wealth that announced itself through understated perfection. I parked on the street and walked up the front path, noting the locations of Sarah's team without appearing to look for them. They were invisible to civilian eyes, positioned in ways that provided complete coverage without drawing attention. The front door opened before I could ring the bell. Margaret stood there in a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary, her smile as bright and false as campaign advertising. "Maya, darling," she said, embracing me with the warmth of someone performing for an audience. "How lovely that you could make it despite David's absence." Inside, the house buzzed with conversation and laughter. The dining room had been expanded with additional tables to accommodate the crowd. Flower arrangements that cost more than most people's rent, crystal glasses catching the light from the chandelier. The kind of setting designed to intimidate anyone who didn't belong. I made the rounds, greeting family members who remembered my name but not much else about me. David's cousin Patricia asked about my work with polite disinterest. His cousin Mark mentioned real estate prices and seemed surprised when I couldn't contribute to the discussion. The usual dance of people trying to place me in their social hierarchy and finding me difficult to categorize. Margaret orchestrated the gathering with the skill of someone who'd been hosting such events for decades. She guided conversations, introduced topics, made sure everyone felt included in the performance of family harmony. Except for me, of course. I was included but not embraced, acknowledged but not welcomed, the charitable exception to their otherwise exclusive club. During the first course, she began what I recognized as her standard interrogation disguised as friendly interest. How was my work, my family, my plans for the future? Each question was designed to highlight the differences between my modest circumstances and their elevated status. I answered politely, giving her nothing to criticize, but nothing to celebrate either. Then she shifted to more dangerous territory. She mentioned David's career trajectory, his potential for partnership at the firm, the social obligations that came with success in his field. All delivered with the subtext that I might be holding him back, that my background might be limiting his opportunities. The same themes she'd explored at the anniversary dinner, but more subtle now, harder to challenge directly. The other guests listened with the polite attention people give to conversations that don't directly concern them, but might become entertaining if they turned contentious. I could feel them evaluating my responses, looking for signs of discomfort or defensiveness. Margaret had chosen her moment well, surrounded by witnesses who would remember how gracefully she'd raised concerns about her son's future. I was about to respond when my earpiece crackled softly. "Package delivered," Sarah's voice said, using our old code for mission commencement. I smiled at Margaret and took a sip of my mimosa, feeling the calm that always came when the waiting ended and action began. Through the dining room window, I could see the first sign that this brunch was about to become memorable. A black SUV pulled into the circular driveway, stopping behind Margaret's Mercedes. The vehicle was unmarked but clearly official, the kind of transportation used by federal agencies and high-level security details. Two men in dark suits emerged, their movements precise and professional. Margaret noticed them too, her conversation faltering as she watched them approach the front door. "Excuse me," she said to the table, her voice showing the first hint of uncertainty I'd ever heard from her. "I should see what they want." She disappeared toward the foyer, leaving the dining room buzzing with speculation about unexpected government visitors. The doorbell rang once, followed by the sound of Margaret's voice greeting the visitors with her usual confidence. The conversation was brief, professional, impossible to overhear from the dining room. Then Margaret returned, her composure intact, but her eyes showing traces of confusion and concern. "Gentlemen from the State Department," she announced to the room, "something about security clearances and background investigations. They asked to speak with Maya briefly."
Every head turned toward me as she delivered this information, her tone suggesting she had no idea why federal agents would be interested in her son's unremarkable wife. I excused myself from the table and walked to the foyer where two men waited with the patient stillness of people accustomed to high-stakes situations. They introduced themselves as Agents Morrison and Blake, showed identification that looked genuine to anyone not trained to spot the subtle differences between real federal credentials and high-quality reproductions. Ms. Rodriguez, Agent Morrison said, "We apologize for interrupting your family gathering. We're conducting routine background updates for personnel with certain security classifications. Would you mind stepping outside for a few minutes to answer some questions?" His tone was polite, but carried the authority of someone not accustomed to being refused. I followed them onto the front porch, aware that Margaret was watching from the window and that the other guests were craning their necks to get a better view of whatever was happening. The agents positioned themselves in a way that blocked the view from inside while making it clear that this was official business, not a social call. For the benefit of our audience, Agent Morrison opened a tablet and began asking questions about my military service, my security clearance status, my current employment. His colleague took notes with the focused attention of someone documenting important information. To anyone watching from inside, it looked like a federal security interview, the kind conducted with people who had access to classified information. They asked about my deployment history, my specialized training, my current availability for consultation on matters of national security. Agent Blake mentioned ongoing operations that might require my expertise, speaking in the careful language that suggested classified information without revealing specifics. The entire conversation was designed to establish my credentials while remaining vague enough to avoid legal complications. After 15 minutes, they thanked me for my time and mentioned that someone from the appropriate agency would be in touch soon about potential opportunities. They shook my hand with the formal courtesy reserved for people who mattered to the federal government, then departed in their official-looking vehicle, leaving behind the impression that Maya Rodriguez was far more significant than anyone had realized. I returned to the dining room to find 34 pairs of eyes staring at me with expressions ranging from curiosity to bewilderment. Margaret's smile had become fixed, the kind of expression people wore when they've received information that didn't fit their existing understanding of the world. She gestured for me to sit down, her voice carefully controlled. "Is everything all right, dear?" she asked. I told her it was just routine follow-up related to my previous military service, nothing to worry about. The casual way I delivered this information seemed to surprise her more than the federal agents had, as if the idea that I might have had a significant military career was more shocking than government investigators showing up at her brunch. David's cousin Rachel leaned forward with undisguised curiosity. "What kind of military service?" she asked. I mentioned that I'd served in Afghanistan, specializing in intelligence operations. The words landed in the dining room like stones in still water, creating ripples of surprise and sudden interest. Margaret's carefully orchestrated social gathering had just been hijacked by a revelation she hadn't seen coming. Before anyone could ask follow-up questions, my earpiece crackled again. "Phase 2 initiated," Sarah's voice said. Through the dining room window, I watched another black vehicle pull into the driveway. This one was larger, more obviously tactical, with the kind of communications equipment that suggested serious federal business. 3 more agents emerged, their bearing unmistakably military despite their civilian clothing. They approached the front door with the purposeful stride of people on official business, and once again, Margaret excused herself to greet unexpected government visitors. The dining room erupted in quiet conversations as family members speculated about why federal agents kept arriving at their peaceful Sunday brunch. This time, Margaret was gone longer, and when she returned, her composure had developed visible cracks. "More agents," she announced, her voice tight with controlled confusion. "They're asking about Maya's security status and whether she's available for immediate consultation on an urgent matter." She looked at me as if seeing a stranger. They seem to think she has expertise they need. I apologized to the table for the disruption and went to meet with the second team of agents. These were Sarah's people, former Navy SEALs and Army Rangers who now worked private security contracts. They played their roles perfectly, treating me with the deference accorded to someone with valuable skills and high-level clearances. Agent Stevens, the team leader, explained that they were conducting a threat assessment for a high-profile client and needed someone with my particular background to review their security protocols.
He mentioned my specialized training in counterintelligence and tactical operations, speaking as if these credentials were common knowledge rather than carefully guarded secrets. The conversation lasted 20 minutes and covered topics that would have been classified if they'd been real: counterterrorism techniques, threat analysis, protective strategies for high-value targets, all delivered in the professional jargon that made it clear I wasn't just a former service member, but someone who'd operated at significant levels within the military intelligence community. When I returned to the dining room this time, the atmosphere had completely changed. The polite indifference I usually encountered from David's family had been replaced by intense curiosity and newfound respect. Margaret's carefully planned brunch had become a showcase for revelations about her daughter-in-law's background that she'd never bothered to investigate. Patricia asked about my deployment history with the kind of interest she'd never shown in my nonprofit work. Mark wanted to know about military contractors and private security firms. Even Margaret's closest friends seemed fascinated by the idea that the quiet woman they'd dismissed as unremarkable might have been involved in classified operations overseas. Margaret herself seemed stunned into uncharacteristic silence. She'd spent 3 years treating me like an inconvenient charity case, someone David had foolishly chosen over more suitable alternatives. The idea that I might have had a distinguished military career, that federal agencies considered me valuable enough to recruit at family gatherings, clearly didn't fit the narrative she'd constructed about my limitations. Then my earpiece delivered the message I'd been waiting for. "Final phase authorized," Sarah said. Showtime. Through the window, I watched the most impressive vehicle yet arrive in Margaret's driveway, a black armored SUV with government plates, the kind used for transporting VIPs and high-level officials, the kind that announced its importance without subtlety. 4 men emerged, their bearing unmistakably elite military. These weren't actors or private contractors playing roles. Sarah had called in favors from people still on active duty, operators from units so classified that most people had never heard of them, Navy SEALs whose existence was officially denied, whose missions were buried so deep that acknowledging them publicly would create diplomatic incidents. Margaret stood at the window watching them approach, her face pale with an anxiety I'd never seen before. When the doorbell rang this time, she seemed reluctant to answer it. The lead operator identified himself as Commander Jackson, mentioned that he was looking for someone with my operational background for an urgent consultation that couldn't wait. The conversation on the front porch was brief but clearly visible to everyone inside. Commander Jackson treated me with the respect accorded to a fellow professional, someone whose expertise was valued at the highest levels of military command. He mentioned classified operations, ongoing missions, the need for immediate tactical consultation from someone with my particular skills. When I returned to the dining room, the silence was absolute. 34 people stared at me as if I'd just revealed myself to be someone completely different from the person they thought they knew. Margaret sat frozen in her chair, her carefully constructed worldview crumbling around the edges. Commander Jackson had left behind a business card with contact information for a secure military line. As I placed it on the table, David's Uncle Richard asked the question everyone was thinking. "Maya," he said carefully, "what exactly did you do in the military?" I looked around the room at faces that had treated me with polite condescension for 3 years. "I specialized in intelligence operations," I said simply. "Counterterrorism, threat assessment, protective services for high-value assets. The kind of work that doesn't appear on standard resumes." I paused, letting that information settle. David knows some of it, but operational security requires keeping certain details confidential. The room erupted in questions. How long had I served? What kind of missions? Why hadn't I mentioned this background before? I answered selectively, providing enough information to establish credibility while maintaining the mystique that made the revelation so powerful. The woman they'd dismissed as insignificant was actually someone whose phone number was apparently kept on file by federal agencies and elite military units. Margaret finally found her voice. "Why didn't you ever mention this?" she asked, her tone suggesting she felt personally betrayed by my failure to provide a complete military biography during family dinners. I looked at her with the same polite smile she'd given me so many times. "You never asked," I said simply. "And honestly, most people aren't particularly interested in hearing war stories at social gatherings. I thought you preferred conversations about things that mattered to your world." The subtle emphasis on your world wasn't lost on anyone present. The brunch continued, but the dynamic had completely shifted.
Instead of being the awkward outsider who didn't quite fit, I'd become the most interesting person in the room. People who'd never bothered learning my last name now wanted to hear about Afghanistan, about military training, about what it was like to work in classified operations. Margaret's performance as gracious hostess became increasingly strained, as the gathering she'd designed to showcase her family's status turned into a celebration of her daughter-in-law's previously hidden credentials. Every question about my service was an implicit reminder that she'd never bothered to learn these details about the woman married to her son. As the afternoon wound down and guests began making their departures, several people approached me privately to express their admiration for my service and their surprise at learning about my background. Patricia mentioned that she'd always sensed there was more to me than met the eye. Mark asked about opportunities in private security and seemed genuinely interested in my professional opinions. Margaret walked me to the door with the mechanical courtesy of someone going through expected motions. "Thank you," she said, her voice hollow. "I'm sure David will be sorry he missed such an interesting afternoon." I assured her that I would give him all the details when he returned from his business crisis. As I walked to my car, I could see her standing in the doorway watching me leave. For the first time since I'd known her, Margaret Whitmore looked uncertain, off balance, like someone who'd just discovered that the world was far more complicated than she'd realized. The woman she'd dismissed as poor and powerless had just demonstrated connections to federal agencies and elite military units. The drive home gave me time to process what had just happened. Sarah's plan had worked perfectly, revealing my background in a way that couldn't be dismissed or minimized.
Margaret and her family now knew that their assumptions about my limitations had been completely wrong, that the quiet woman they'd patronized for 3 years had capabilities they'd never imagined. But more importantly, I'd reclaimed my own narrative. Instead of being defined by Margaret's narrow categories of worth, I'd revealed myself as someone whose value couldn't be measured by bank accounts or social standing. Someone whose strength came from experiences that made civilian social dynamics seem trivial by comparison. When I reached our apartment, my phone was already ringing. David calling from the office with excitement and confusion. "My cousin Rachel just called," he said. "She told me federal agents showed up at Mom's brunch looking for you. She said something about classified operations and military consulting. Maya, what the hell happened today?" I smiled as I unlocked our front door. "Your family learned something new about me," I said. "Something your mother probably wishes she'd known before she decided I wasn't good enough for their social circle." David was silent for a moment, processing this information. "Are you telling me that my mother just discovered she's been underestimating you for 3 years?" he asked finally. I confirmed that was essentially accurate. "And that federal agents and Navy SEALs showed up at her house to consult with you about classified matters?" he continued, his voice growing more amazed with each word. "Something like that," I said, enjoying his bewilderment. "I told you there were things about my service record that I didn't usually discuss at dinner parties. Turns out your family was more interested in hearing about them than I expected." David laughed, a sound of pure delight and vindication. "I can't wait to see her face when I get home tomorrow," he said. "After 3 years of treating you like some kind of charity case, she just found out she's been wrong about everything." I reminded him to be diplomatic, that the goal wasn't to humiliate his mother, but to establish a new foundation for our relationship. But privately, I was already looking forward to the next family gathering. Margaret's reign as the arbiter of social acceptability in the Whitmore family had just encountered its first serious challenge. The woman she'd tried to diminish had revealed herself to be someone whose background made her dinner party expertise look trivial by comparison. The war wasn't over, but the battlefield had definitely shifted in my favor. David came home Tuesday evening with the expression of someone who'd spent 48 hours trying to reconcile 2 completely different versions of reality. His business crisis had resolved itself Monday afternoon, but he'd stayed at the office an extra day processing phone calls from relatives who couldn't stop talking about Sunday's revelations. He found me in the kitchen preparing dinner, moving with the quiet efficiency I'd learned during years of military training. "You've been holding out on me," he said, setting down his briefcase and pulling me into his arms. "Rachel called 3 times yesterday. Mark sent me articles about private military contractors. Even my father asked if I knew you had security clearances." I kissed him and suggested we talk over dinner, knowing this conversation would reshape our relationship in ways neither of us fully understood yet.
Over pasta and wine, I told him things I'd never shared with anyone outside my unit. About the training that pushed human limits beyond what most people could imagine. About missions in places that didn't officially exist, protecting assets whose names would never appear in history books. About the bonds forged with teammates who'd trusted me with their lives and earned my absolute loyalty in return. David listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from amazement to understanding to something deeper, pride maybe, or recognition that the woman he'd married was more complex than either of them had realized. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, processing information that explained years of small details he'd never quite understood. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he asked finally. I explained that civilian life required different skills, different identities, that most people weren't equipped to handle the reality of what military service actually involved, that I'd wanted to be Maya the nonprofit manager, not Ghost the intelligence operative when we'd built our life together. He reached across the table and took my hand. "I understand why you kept it private," he said, "but seeing my family's reaction, seeing how they've treated you all these years while having no idea who you really are, it makes me furious and proud and sorry I didn't protect you better." I assured him that protection wasn't his responsibility, that I'd chosen to handle Margaret's behavior in my own way. The rest of the week passed quietly. Margaret didn't call, didn't text, didn't issue her usual invitations to impromptu family gatherings. The silence felt significant, like the pause between lightning and thunder when you know the storm is about to break. David mentioned that his mother seemed subdued during their brief phone conversations, distracted in ways that suggested she was processing uncomfortable revelations. Friday afternoon brought the call I'd been expecting. Margaret's voice was carefully controlled, formal in the way people sounded when they were working from a script they'd rehearsed. "Maya," she said, "I was wondering if you might have time for coffee this weekend. There are some things I'd like to discuss with you privately." I agreed to meet her Saturday morning at a quiet cafe near the university, neutral territory where neither of us held home field advantage. She arrived 15 minutes early. I could see her through the window when I approached, sitting rigidly at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup like it might provide moral support. She stood when I entered, her smile brittle and uncertain. "Thank you," she said, gesturing toward the chair across from her. I ordered tea and sat down, waiting for her to find whatever words she'd rehearsed for this encounter. The silence stretched between us, heavy with years of accumulated tension and recent revelations that had upended her understanding of our relationship. "I owe you an apology," she said finally, the words seeming to cause her physical pain. "Several apologies, actually. I've treated you poorly since David brought you home, and Sunday's events have made me realize how wrong I've been about you." She paused, looking down at her hands. "I made assumptions based on incomplete information." I sipped my tea and waited for her to continue. Margaret wasn't accustomed to apologies, and the effort was clearly costing her. Her usual confidence had been replaced by something I'd never seen before, uncertainty about her ability to control the narrative of her own family story. "When David first brought you home," she continued, "I saw someone who didn't fit our social circle, someone who might limit his opportunities or hold him back professionally. I thought I was protecting him by maintaining appropriate distance. I realize now that my perspective was narrow and unfair." She looked up at me then, her eyes showing genuine distress. "Those federal agents who came to the house, the military personnel who spoke about classified operations, I had no idea you had that kind of background, that you'd served your country in such significant ways, that you had skills and experiences that made my concerns about social compatibility seem trivial." I leaned back in my chair, studying the woman who'd spent 3 years making me feel unwelcome in her family. The apology was real, motivated by genuine shock at discovering how wrong she'd been about my background.
But it was also strategic, an attempt to repair a relationship she now realized might be important to maintain. "Margaret," I said carefully, "I appreciate the apology, but I need you to understand something. My worth as a person, as David's wife, as a member of your family, isn't determined by my military service or my security clearances. It wasn't determined by my job or my bank account or my parents' professions either." She nodded quickly, eager to show understanding. "Of course, you're absolutely right. I should have seen your character, your love for David, your contributions to our family. The external things shouldn't have mattered." I held up a hand to stop her, knowing she was missing the deeper point. They shouldn't have mattered because they don't actually matter, I said. Not the military credentials you're impressed by now, and not the financial limitations you criticized before. David fell in love with who I am as a person, not what I've accomplished professionally, or what I might contribute to his career advancement. Margaret looked confused, as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. But surely, your service record, your security clearances, those are significant achievements that deserve recognition, she said. I could see her trying to recategorize me, to find a new box that would make sense of the cognitive dissonance between her previous dismissal and her current respect. They are achievements, I agreed, but they're not what makes me worthy of David's love or your family's acceptance. The woman you met 3 years ago, the one who worked at a nonprofit and shopped at thrift stores and couldn't contribute to conversations about real estate investments, that woman deserved basic respect and courtesy regardless of her hidden credentials. The silence that followed was uncomfortable but necessary. Margaret was intelligent enough to understand what I was saying, even if accepting it required acknowledging fundamental flaws in her worldview. She'd spent 3 years treating me poorly based on assumptions about my value, and discovering that I had impressive credentials didn't erase the cruelty of that treatment. "How do we move forward?" she asked finally. "What can I do to repair the damage I've caused?" I considered the question seriously, knowing that David's relationship with his family depended partly on finding a workable solution. That my own peace of mind required establishing boundaries that would prevent future humiliation. "You can start by treating me the way you'd treat any woman your son chose to marry," I said, "with basic courtesy and respect, regardless of my background or accomplishments. You can stop making comments about financial compatibility or social expectations. You can accept that David's happiness is more important than your approval of his choices." Margaret nodded earnestly, taking notes in her mental playbook for managing family relationships. But I wasn't finished. "And you can acknowledge that respect shouldn't be conditional on impressive credentials," I continued. "The next woman who marries into your family might not have a military background or federal security clearances. She might actually be exactly what you thought I was, someone from modest circumstances with limited professional achievements. She'll still deserve to be treated with dignity." The words hit their target. Margaret's face flushed as she realized I was describing a fundamental character flaw, not just a misunderstanding about my specific situation. She'd revealed herself as someone whose respect was transactional, based on social status and professional achievements rather than basic human worth. "You're right," she said quietly, "and I'm ashamed of how I've behaved. Not just toward you, but of what that behavior says about my values. I thought I was being protective of David, but I was actually being elitist and cruel." I accepted her acknowledgement with a nod, appreciating the honesty even as I remained skeptical about lasting change. We talked for another hour, establishing ground rules for future interactions. No more comments about my background or suitability for David. No more pointed questions about finances or career plans. No more subtle reminders that I didn't quite fit their social expectations. Margaret agreed to everything, clearly desperate to repair a relationship she now understood she'd seriously damaged. When we parted, she hugged me with what seemed like genuine warmth. "Thank you for giving me a chance to apologize," she said, "and thank you for your service to our country. I should have said that 3 years ago." I drove home feeling cautiously optimistic, but not entirely convinced that Margaret had truly changed rather than simply recalibrated her strategy. David was waiting when I got home, anxious to hear how the conversation had gone. I told him about the apology, about Margaret's obvious shock at learning about my background, about the commitments she'd made regarding future behavior. He seemed relieved, but not surprised by his mother's ability to adapt when circumstances required it. "She's always been strategic," he said. "The difference now is that her strategy involves treating you well instead of pushing you away." I asked if he thought the change would last, if Margaret was capable of maintaining respect based on new understanding rather than old prejudices. David considered the question seriously. "I think she genuinely feels bad about how she treated you," he said. "But more than that, I think she's scared.
scared that she almost destroyed our marriage through her behavior, scared that she misjudged you so completely, scared that there might be other things about people she doesn't understand. The next few weeks tested Margaret's commitment to her new approach. Family dinners resumed their regular schedule, but the dynamic had shifted fundamentally. Instead of being tolerated as an unfortunate appendage to David's life, I was included in conversations with the same attention given to other family members. Margaret asked about my work with genuine interest, remembered details from previous conversations, treated me like someone whose opinions mattered. The change was dramatic enough to be noticed by other family members. Patricia mentioned how nice it was to see Margaret and me getting along better. Mark commented that the family felt more harmonious now that the tension between David's wife and mother had resolved. Even David's father, who'd always remained diplomatically neutral, seemed more relaxed during family gatherings. But the real test came 6 weeks later, when Margaret announced her annual charity gala. The event was her signature social occasion, a carefully orchestrated evening that raised money for children's hospitals while showcasing the Whitmore family's philanthropic leadership. In previous years, I'd been included as an obligation, seated at tables far from the action, introduced with apologetic explanations about David's personal choices. This year, Margaret called me personally to discuss the event. She wanted to feature my nonprofit work prominently, to highlight military veterans' transition services as one of the gala's focus areas. She asked if I'd be willing to speak about my organization's mission to help raise awareness and funding for programs supporting returning service members. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who'd spent 3 years minimizing my professional achievements now wanted to showcase them for her social benefit. But the opportunity to raise money for veteran services was too important to reject based on personal grievances. I agreed to participate, with conditions about how the evening would be structured and what message would be emphasized. The gala was held at the Four Seasons, with 300 guests representing Seattle's social and business elite.
Margaret had transformed the ballroom into an elegant showcase for the causes she supported, with displays highlighting the impact of previous fundraising efforts. My organization's materials were prominently featured, with professional photographs and testimonials from veterans who'd received assistance. When Margaret introduced me to the audience, her words were carefully chosen to emphasize my work rather than my military credentials. Maya Rodriguez manages one of our region's most effective veteran transition programs, she said. Her organization has helped hundreds of returning service members find employment, housing, and community support. Tonight, we're honored to hear about their mission and impact. My speech focused on the challenges veterans faced when returning to civilian life, the gaps in existing support systems, the difference that community organizations could make with adequate funding. I mentioned my own service only briefly, in the context of understanding the population we served. The response was enthusiastic, with several major donors approaching afterward to discuss potential partnerships. During the reception that followed, Margaret introduced me to her friends and business associates as someone doing important work in the community. Not as David's wife who happened to have a job, but as a professional whose organization merited support and recognition. The change in her presentation was subtle but significant, acknowledging my independent worth rather than my relationship to her family. Near the end of the evening, she pulled me aside for a private conversation. "You were magnificent tonight," she said, her pride seemingly genuine. "The way you spoke about the veterans' needs, the passion you showed for the work, it was inspiring. Several people have already committed to major donations because of your presentation." I thanked her for the opportunity and for featuring our work so prominently. But I also used the moment to reinforce the broader lesson. "This is who I've always been, Margaret," I said gently. "The person who cares about service, who works to help others, who believes in making a difference. Military credentials didn't create that character, they just gave me specific ways to express it." She nodded thoughtfully. "I'm beginning to understand that," she said, "and I'm sorry it took me so long to see it." We stood together watching the crowd of donors and supporters, people whose wealth and influence could transform the lives of struggling veterans. The evening had raised more money for our organization than any previous fundraising effort. But more importantly, it had demonstrated that respect and recognition could be earned through character and commitment rather than impressive credentials or family connections.
Margaret had learned to value my work not because she'd discovered my military background, but because she'd finally bothered to pay attention to what I was actually doing with my life. The drive home that night gave David and me time to reflect on how much had changed since that awful anniversary dinner just 2 months earlier. Margaret's public humiliation had triggered a series of events that ultimately transformed our family relationships in ways none of us had anticipated. The woman who dismissed me as unworthy now promoted my work to her influential social circle. But the real victory wasn't Margaret's changed behavior, it was my own transformation, from someone who absorbed cruelty silently to someone who demanded respect and got it. The military training that had taught me to survive in hostile environments had finally been applied to the most challenging battlefield of all, family dynamics. David reached over and took my hand as we drove through the quiet streets of our neighborhood. "I'm proud of you," he said, "not because of what you accomplished tonight, but because of how you handled everything. The way you stood up for yourself, the way you made her understand that respect isn't conditional on achievements, the way you turned a terrible situation into something positive." I squeezed his hand and smiled, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from fighting a battle on my own terms and winning decisively. Margaret would never again question my worthiness to be part of her family. More importantly, I would never again doubt my own right to demand basic respect and courtesy from anyone, regardless of their social status or family position. The war was over, and I had emerged not just victorious, but transformed. The quiet woman who'd once absorbed humiliation in silence had become someone who commanded respect through strength of character rather than impressive credentials. Margaret had learned that some people's backgrounds weren't what they appeared to be. But more importantly, she'd learned that everyone's worth transcended whatever achievements might be listed on their resume. 3 months later, Margaret called to ask if I'd considered joining the board of her Children's Hospital Foundation. Not because she needed someone with security clearances, but because she'd recognized my organizational skills and commitment to service. I accepted, knowing that the position would give me opportunities to expand programs supporting military families and their children. The little girl who'd once been dismissed as poor and powerless had grown into a woman who commanded rooms full of influential people and directed resources towards causes that mattered. Margaret's attempt to diminish me had ultimately revealed strength she'd never suspected, capabilities she'd never imagined, connections she'd never considered. But the real lesson wasn't about hidden credentials or impressive backgrounds. It was about refusing to accept other people's limitations on your worth, about demanding respect as a basic right rather than a privilege to be earned, about recognizing that true strength sometimes looked like quiet endurance until the moment came to reveal exactly who you really were. The Navy SEALs who'd guarded Margaret's anniversary of understanding were just the visible symbol of invisible networks that surrounded people who'd earned loyalty through service and sacrifice. But the real protection came from within, from knowing your own worth, regardless of whether others recognized it, from refusing to be diminished by people who mistook quiet strength for weakness. Margaret never made that mistake again, and neither did anyone else who witnessed what happened when someone tried to burn bridges with the wrong person. Some fires revealed more than they destroyed, and some women were forged rather than broken by the flames. The board position at Margaret's Children's Hospital Foundation proved to be more demanding than I'd anticipated. Our monthly meetings stretched into afternoon sessions as we wrestled with budget allocations, program evaluations, and strategic planning for the upcoming fiscal year. The conference room on the 15th floor of the Westlake Center offered panoramic views of Elliott Bay, but my attention stayed focused on the financial reports spread across the mahogany table. Margaret had changed in ways that continued to surprise me. The woman who'd once questioned my ability to navigate social obligations now deferred to my expertise on organizational management and community outreach. When disagreements arose between board members, she often turned to me for perspective, treating my opinions with the same weight she gave to the Foundation's longtime supporters. The transformation felt genuine but fragile, like new growth that hadn't yet developed deep roots. During our third board meeting, a discussion about expanding services to military families became heated when one member questioned whether veterans' children faced unique challenges that warranted specialized programming. Margaret's defense of the proposal was swift and informed, citing statistics I'd shared with her about deployment stress and family readjustment issues. After the meeting, she lingered as other members filed out, gathering their papers and scheduling follow-up calls. When we were alone, she approached with the careful manner of someone still learning to navigate a relationship they damaged and rebuilt. Maya, she said, I wanted to thank you for the information you provided about military families. I had no idea the statistics were so concerning. I appreciated her acknowledgement, but recognized an opportunity to address something that had been bothering me. Margaret, I said, I'm glad you're supporting these programs, but I need to ask you something directly. Are you advocating for military families because you genuinely care about the cause, or because you're trying to demonstrate support for my background? The question hung between us like a challenge she hadn't expected. Her immediate impulse seemed to be reassurance, to insist that her motivations were pure, but she stopped herself and considered the question more carefully. Both, she admitted finally. I do care about the children who need these services, but I also want to show you that I value your perspective and experience. I respected her honesty, even as it confirmed my suspicions. The line between genuine conversion and strategic adaptation was often thin, especially with someone as politically astute as Margaret. But her willingness to examine her own motivations suggested growth beyond simple reputation management. Over the following months, I watched for signs that would distinguish authentic change from sophisticated performance. Margaret's interactions with other family members provided the clearest indicators. When David's cousin brought his new girlfriends to a family dinner, Margaret's behavior toward the young woman was markedly different from her previous approach with me. She asked about the girlfriend's work with genuine interest, included her in conversations naturally, avoided the subtle interrogation techniques she'd once used to establish social hierarchies. The real test came when David's younger brother announced his engagement to a teacher from Tacoma, whose family owned a small restaurant.
The woman, Jessica, came from exactly the kind of background Margaret had once found unsuitable: modest income, working-class parents, practical rather than prestigious career choices. But Margaret's response was warmth and celebration, without the undercurrent of judgment that had poisoned her early interactions with me. Jessica confided in me after several family gatherings that she'd been nervous about meeting David's family, having heard stories about their social expectations and demanding standards. But Margaret had made her feel welcomed from their first meeting, asking about her students, her teaching philosophy, her plans for the wedding. The acceptance seemed effortless, natural, free from the calculated assessment that had characterized Margaret's evaluation of my suitability. The contrast was striking enough that David noticed and commented on it. "She's really changed," he said one evening, as we drove home from a family dinner, where Margaret had spent most of the evening listening to Jessica's stories about her classroom experiences. 3 years ago, she would have found a dozen ways to suggest that Jessica wasn't sophisticated enough for our family. Tonight, she seemed genuinely interested in everything Jessica had to say. I agreed that the change appeared real, but I remained cautious about declaring complete victory. People could modify their behavior for extended periods when circumstances demanded it, especially when the stakes involved family relationships and social standing. The true measure would be whether Margaret's new approach persisted through challenges and stresses that tested her commitment to treating people with basic respect regardless of their background. That test came sooner than expected. The Foundation's annual audit revealed financial irregularities that suggested either incompetence or deliberate mismanagement by our accounting firm. The discovery triggered emergency board meetings, legal consultations, and intense scrutiny from donors who'd trusted us with their contributions. Margaret's reputation as a reliable steward of charitable resources was suddenly under threat. During the crisis, I watched how she handled pressure and whether stress would cause her to revert to old patterns of behavior. The Margaret I'd first met might have looked for scapegoats among board members, particularly those without the social connections to defend themselves effectively. But throughout weeks of investigation and crisis management, her focus remained on solving problems rather than assigning blame. She worked closely with our legal team to ensure full transparency with regulatory authorities. She personally called major donors to explain the situation and outline our corrective measures. She accepted responsibility for oversight failures without deflecting criticism onto other board members or staff. The grace under pressure demonstrated character development that went beyond surface-level behavioral adjustments. The accounting firm investigation ultimately revealed systematic errors rather than deliberate fraud, but the damage to the Foundation's reputation required months of rebuilding trust. Margaret's handling of the crisis earned respect from board members and donors who might have withdrawn support if she'd responded defensively or tried to minimize the seriousness of the situation. During one particularly difficult board meeting where we discussed potential budget cuts to essential programs, Margaret made a suggestion that surprised everyone present. She proposed reducing funding for the annual gala that served as her signature social event, redirecting those resources toward direct services for children and families. The suggestion meant sacrificing the occasion that had long showcased her influence and social leadership. The proposal generated debate among board members who understood the gala's importance for donor cultivation and community visibility. But Margaret defended the idea with arguments focused entirely on maximizing impact for the families we served. The woman who'd once treated charity work as an extension of her social calendar was now prioritizing substance over spectacle. I supported her proposal, as did most of the board, and we implemented a scaled-back fundraising approach that emphasized direct donor engagement over elaborate events. The results exceeded our expectations, with several major contributors increasing their support specifically because they appreciated our commitment to operational efficiency over social display. The success of Margaret's strategy revealed how much her understanding of leadership and influence had evolved. She discovered that authentic commitment to a cause generated more respect and support than carefully orchestrated performances designed to enhance personal status. The realization seemed to liberate her from the exhausting work of constantly managing appearances and social positioning. Our working relationship on the foundation board became genuinely collaborative as Margaret learned to value diverse perspectives and expertise over social credentials. When we disagreed about program priorities or strategic directions, our discussions remained focused on evidence and outcomes rather than personal authority or family dynamics. She demonstrated the intellectual humility that had been missing from her previous approach to family relationships. The transformation extended to her interactions with David as well. Instead of offering unsolicited advice about his career choices or personal decisions, she began asking questions and listening to his responses. She showed interest in his work satisfaction and personal happiness rather than just his professional advancement and social standing. The change created space for a more authentic relationship between mother and son. David noticed the difference and seemed both relieved and somewhat bewildered by his mother's evolution. "She actually asked me yesterday if I was happy with my job," he told me after a family dinner. "Not whether I thought it was advancing my career or building the right network, but whether the work itself satisfied me. I can't remember her ever asking that question before." The foundation work also provided opportunities for Margaret to interact with families from backgrounds very different from her own social circle. Our program served children from immigrant families, single-parent households, and communities struggling with poverty and limited resources. Margaret's direct exposure to these families challenged assumptions she'd held about success, failure, and personal worth. I watched her listen carefully to a mother describing her challenges accessing mental health services for her child with autism. Margaret asked thoughtful questions, took notes, and followed up with research about service gaps and potential solutions. The woman who'd once measured people's value by their social status was learning to see strength and dignity in circumstances she'd never considered. During a site visit to one of our supported programs, Margaret spent an hour talking with a teenage girl whose father was deployed overseas and whose mother worked 2 jobs to support the family. The conversation revealed Margaret's growing understanding that resilience and character weren't distributed according to economic status or social position. The girl, Ashley, spoke with quiet pride about helping care for her younger siblings and maintaining good grades despite the challenges of having a deployed parent. Margaret listened with the focused attention she'd once reserved for conversations about stock portfolios and vacation plans. When Ashley mentioned her goal of becoming a nurse practitioner, Margaret asked about her educational plans and offered to connect her with scholarship opportunities. After we left the program site, Margaret was unusually quiet during the drive back to the office. Finally, she said, "That girl has more strength and maturity than most adults I know. 3 years ago, I would have dismissed her family's circumstances as evidence of poor planning or limited ambition. Now I see someone facing enormous challenges with grace and determination." The admission revealed how profoundly Margaret's worldview had shifted. She was learning to recognize qualities like courage, resilience, and integrity regardless of the economic or social context in which they appeared.
The realization seemed to humble her in ways that had nothing to do with my military background or professional credentials. Our relationship continued evolving as Margaret demonstrated sustained commitment to the changes she'd made. She began asking about my family, showing genuine interest in my parents' lives and my siblings' careers. She remembered details from previous conversations and followed up with thoughtful questions that indicated she was paying attention to things that mattered to me. When my father was hospitalized for emergency surgery, Margaret called to ask if there was anything she could do to help. She offered to arrange transportation, coordinate meals, or provide any other support David and I might need during the crisis. The gesture felt authentic rather than performative, motivated by genuine concern rather than social obligation. The most significant test of Margaret's transformation came during the Foundation's annual review process. Our programs had achieved measurable improvements in children's outcomes, our financial management had been recognized for transparency and efficiency, and our donor base had expanded significantly. The board was unanimous in praising Margaret's leadership during a challenging year. But when the local newspaper wanted to feature Margaret in a profile about successful nonprofit leadership, she declined the interview. Instead, she suggested they focus on the families served by our programs and the staff members who provided direct services. The decision surprised board members who knew how much Margaret had once valued media recognition and social visibility. Her explanation revealed the depth of her personal growth. "Individual recognition isn't what matters," she said during our board meeting. "What matters is whether we're making a real difference in children's lives. If the newspaper wants to tell our story, they should tell the stories of the families who've benefited from these programs." The suggestion reflected a fundamental shift in how Margaret understood leadership and success. She'd moved beyond viewing charitable work as a platform for social prominence to seeing it as an opportunity for meaningful service. The change wasn't just behavioral, it represented a transformation in her core values and priorities. David and I discussed Margaret's evolution during quiet moments at home, marveling at the scope of changes that had emerged from what began as a family crisis. "David actually asked me yesterday if I was happy with my job," he told me after a family dinner. "Not whether I thought it was advancing my career or building the right network, but whether the work itself satisfied me. I can't remember her ever asking that question before." The foundation work also provided opportunities for Margaret to interact with families from backgrounds very different from her own social circle. Our program served children from immigrant families, single-parent households, and communities struggling with poverty and limited resources. Margaret's direct exposure to these families challenged assumptions she'd held about success, failure, and personal worth. I watched her listen carefully to a mother describing her challenges accessing mental health services for her child. The woman who'd once dismissed me as unsuitable for her son had become someone I genuinely respected and enjoyed working with. The relationship felt authentic rather than obligatory, built on shared values rather than family duty. The foundation board work also created opportunities for Margaret and I to travel together for conferences and site visits. During these trips, away from family dynamics and social expectations, we developed a friendship based on common interests and complementary skills. Margaret's strategic thinking and social connections balanced my operational expertise and program knowledge. On a flight back from a national conference on pediatric health services, Margaret brought up the subject that had shaped our relationship for so many years. "I want you to know," she said, "that my behavior toward you during those first years was inexcusable, not just wrong, but cruel. I justified it as protecting David, but the truth is that I was protecting my own narrow view of what his life should look like." I appreciated her willingness to revisit painful history, but I was more interested in understanding what had enabled such profound change. "What made the difference?" I asked. "What helped you see things differently?" She considered the question carefully, looking out the airplane window at the landscape passing below. "Discovering your military background was the catalyst," she said, "but it wasn't really the answer. The real change came from realizing that my judgments about people's worth were based on superficial criteria that had nothing to do with character or capability. I'd spent so much energy maintaining social boundaries that I'd lost sight of what actually matters." She turned back to me with an expression of genuine regret. "You could have been exactly what I thought you were, a woman from modest circumstances with limited professional achievements, and you still would have deserved better treatment. David's happiness should have been evidence enough of your value, regardless of anything else."
The acknowledgement meant more to me than any apology she'd offered previously. It demonstrated understanding that went beyond our specific situation to encompass broader questions about human dignity and respect. Margaret had learned lessons that would influence how she treated everyone, not just family members she'd misjudged. The conversation marked a turning point in our relationship. We'd moved beyond the careful politeness of recent years to something approaching genuine friendship. The foundation work had provided a context for collaboration and mutual respect that existed independently of family obligations or social expectations. By the end of my second year on the foundation board, Margaret had become someone I genuinely enjoyed spending time with. Our conversations ranged from program strategy to personal philosophy, from family dynamics to broader social issues. She sought my perspective on decisions and valued my input in ways that felt natural rather than forced. The transformation was so complete that new board members who joined our organization had no sense of the previous tension between us. They saw Margaret and me as collaborative partners who worked effectively together despite our different backgrounds and approaches. The history of conflict and reconciliation remained invisible to outside observers. During the Foundation's holiday celebration, Margaret gave a speech thanking board members for their service and dedication. When she mentioned my contributions, her words carried the same respect and appreciation she showed to longtime supporters and major donors. The recognition felt genuine, earned through work and commitment rather than social obligation. As the evening wound down and board members began departing, Margaret approached me with the warm familiarity that had gradually replaced her former careful formality. "Thank you for taking a chance on working with me," she said. "I know it wasn't easy, given our history, but this partnership has been one of the most rewarding aspects of my work with the Foundation." I assured her that the collaboration had been equally valuable for me, that I'd learned things about nonprofit governance and donor relations that would benefit my career for years to come. But more importantly, I'd witnessed a level of personal growth that gave me hope about people's capacity for change when they were willing to examine their own assumptions and behaviors. The drive home that night gave me time to reflect on the unlikely journey that had brought Margaret and me from antagonists to allies. The woman who'd once humiliated me at a family dinner had become someone whose leadership I respected and whose friendship I valued. The transformation hadn't erased the pain of those early years, but it had created something positive from the wreckage of our initial relationship. David was waiting when I arrived home, curious about the evening's events and the continued evolution of my relationship with his mother. "She's become a different person," he said as I described Margaret's speech in our conversation afterward. "Sometimes I feel like I'm getting to know her for the first time." I understood what he meant. The Margaret who'd emerged from our family crisis was more authentic, more thoughtful, more genuinely engaged with the world around her than the woman who'd prioritized social status above human connection. The changes had freed her to develop real relationships rather than managing performances designed to maintain her position in Seattle's social hierarchy. The story of our relationship had become something neither of us could have predicted. What began with public humiliation and family warfare had evolved into mutual respect and genuine collaboration. The Navy SEALs who disrupted Margaret's anniversary celebration were long gone, but the lessons learned during that dramatic demonstration continued shaping how she understood power, respect, and human worth. The transformation proved that even the most entrenched patterns of behavior could change when people were willing to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. Margaret's journey from cruelty to kindness hadn't been easy or quick, but it had been authentic. She'd discovered that treating people with dignity and respect generated more genuine influence than any amount of social positioning or family manipulation. The foundation work continued providing opportunities for growth and learning for both of us. Margaret's evolution from someone who judged people by their social credentials to someone who valued character and commitment above external achievements represented a fundamental shift in worldview that influenced every aspect of her life. Our partnership demonstrated that relationships damaged by prejudice and misunderstanding could be rebuilt on foundations of mutual respect and shared purpose. The process required acknowledgement of past harm, commitment to different behavior, and patience while trust developed slowly over time. But the result was something stronger and more meaningful than what had existed before the crisis. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about the young woman who'd sat silently through Margaret's humiliating dinner speech just 2 years earlier.
That woman had possessed strength and dignity that weren't visible to people who measured worth by superficial standards. The Navy SEALs had simply provided a dramatic way to reveal capabilities that had always existed beneath the surface. But the real victory hadn't been the shock of revelation or the satisfaction of turning tables on someone who'd underestimated me. The real victory was the transformation of a toxic relationship into something positive and productive. Margaret had learned to see beyond her prejudices, and I'd learned that demanding respect could lead to genuine change rather than just temporary compliance. The journey from conflict to collaboration had required both of us to grow in ways we hadn't anticipated. Margaret had confronted uncomfortable truths about her own biases and limitations. I'd discovered that strength sometimes meant giving people opportunities to change rather than simply protecting myself from their cruelty. The foundation work would continue, providing services to children and families who needed support and advocacy. Margaret's leadership would be shaped by hard-won wisdom about human worth and social responsibility. Our partnership would serve as evidence that even the most damaged relationships could be rebuilt on foundations of mutual respect and shared purpose. The process required acknowledgement of past harm, commitment to different behavior, and patience while trust developed slowly over time. But the result was something stronger and more meaningful than what had existed before the crisis. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about the young woman who'd sat silently through Margaret's humiliating dinner speech just 2 years earlier. That woman had possessed strength and dignity that weren't visible to people who measured worth by superficial standards. The Navy SEALs had simply provided a dramatic way to reveal capabilities that had always existed beneath the surface. But the real victory hadn't been the shock of revelation or the satisfaction of turning tables on someone who'd underestimated me. The real victory was the transformation of a toxic relationship into something positive and productive. Margaret had learned to see beyond her prejudices, and I'd learned that demanding respect could lead to genuine change rather than just temporary compliance. The journey from conflict to collaboration had required both of us to grow in ways we hadn't anticipated. Margaret had confronted uncomfortable truths about her own biases and limitations. I'd discovered that strength sometimes meant giving people opportunities to change rather than simply protecting myself from their cruelty. The foundation work would continue, providing services to children and families who need support and advocacy. Margaret's leadership would be shaped by hard-won wisdom about human worth and social responsibility. Our partnership would serve as evidence that even the most damaged relationships could be rebuilt when people were willing to do the difficult work of genuine change. The Navy SEALs had guarded more than just an anniversary celebration. They'd protected an opportunity for growth and redemption that might not have emerged without the dramatic disruption of Margaret's assumptions about power and respect. Sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, with patience, persistence, and the quiet determination to demand better from ourselves and others. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.